My son screamed that my home was trash, pointing to the gate like he was evicting a stranger. He thought he was cutting off a burden, blissfully unaware that the $10 million inheritance he bragged about was never his. As I dragged my suitcase down the driveway, I carried a single envelope that would wipe away the future he thought he deserved. He kicked me out, but I was the one walking away with everything. My name is Margaret Doyle, and at 63 years old, I stood on the splintering porch of the house I had kept warm for over 40 years, clutching a lemon-scented rag like a lifeline. The October wind in Brookfield, Ohio, usually smelled of burning leaves and damp earth. But today, the air tasted entirely of humiliation. The late afternoon sun cast long, unforgiving shadows across the yard, highlighting the peeling white paint that my son was currently screaming about. Ethan stood at the bottom of the brick steps, his chest heaving beneath the fine wool of his Redwood Harbor Capital suit. He looked like a man who had just conquered Wall Street. Yet here he was, red-faced and waging war against an old woman in a cardigan. He jabbed a finger at the wooden siding, his voice cracking with a rage that seemed too big for the quiet suburbs. "This house is trash," Mom Ethan yelled, the veins in his neck bulging. "I am not letting my wife and kids live in this garbage dump anymore." Behind him stood Kayla, my daughter-in-law. She was cradling the baby against her chest, using the infant like a moral shield. She wrinkled her nose as if the scent of my pot roast from the kitchen was toxic waste. "She needs to go into that care facility." "Ethan," Kayla said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was meant to be heard. "The mold here is probably affecting the baby's lungs. This place needs to be bulldozed." I saw the curtains twitch in the house next door. Mrs. Gable was watching, probably wondering if she should call the police or just grab some popcorn. Shame burned hot on my face, but I froze when Ethan took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes crushing the marigolds I had planted last spring. "This is my house. Mom!" He spat out. "The papers are in my name. You are just a guest here. Do you understand? You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome." I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to remind him of the nights I worked double shifts to pay the mortgage on this trash. But then I saw him. My eldest grandson was standing in the dark rectangle of the open doorway, his eyes wide and watery with fear. He looked between his father and me, trembling. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I would not be the one to shatter his world today. I clamped my lips shut, holding back a lifetime of truths to protect one innocent boy. Ethan took my silence for submission. He reached for my battered suitcase, which was sitting near the welcome mat, and heaved it toward the edge of the porch. It hit the concrete with a sickening thud. The zipper burst slightly, and a few items spilled out, including a framed photograph of my ex-husband, Rick. The glass shattered against the brick. As I looked at the broken image of the man who had abandoned us, I heard Rick's voice echoing through Ethan's words. "You are pathetic, Margaret. You are nothing without me." It was terrifying how much my son sounded like the father he claimed to hate. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat command. He stepped up, shoved me lightly away from the doorframe, and grabbed the handle. "We are done here." The door slammed shut inches from my face. The sound was final, like a gunshot. Ethan thought he had just cleared the debris from his life. He believed this was simply a renovation project, A necessary step before he claimed the $10 million inheritance he told everyone was his birthright. I picked up my suitcase, ignoring the tremors in my hands. As I walked down the brick path, the ground no longer felt like the ancestral soil I had cherished. It felt like the wreckage of a life spent being treated as an accessory. But inside my handbag, the heavy cream envelope with the Levin and Cross logo pressed against my side. It was a tangible weight, a silent promise of power that Ethan had been too arrogant to notice. I did not go to Mrs. Gable's house for tea and sympathy. I pulled out my phone and summoned a car. When the sedan arrived, the driver, a young man with kind eyes, looked at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled away from the curb. "You okay?" "Mom?" he asked softly. "You look a little shaken." I smoothed my skirt and looked out the window as my house, disappeared from view. "I am fine," I replied, my voice steady. "I have just been freed from a house I bought twice." He frowned, confused, but I did not explain. An hour later, the city lights of Cleveland were a blur of neon and rain. I walked into the hushed, carpeted lobby of Levin and Cross. The receptionist nodded, expecting me. I was led into the main conference room where Gloria Levin was waiting, a file open on the glass table. It was nearly midnight, but she looked as sharp as a tack. I sat down and placed the thick envelope on the polished mahogany surface between us. "It is done," I said, looking Gloria in the eye. "It is time to move my son's $10 million inheritance to its rightful owner. 5 years ago." I stood in the fluorescent-lit break room of Northbridge Mutual Assurance in Cleveland, holding a paper plate with a slice of sheet cake that was too sweet and too dry. It was my retirement party, after 38 years of filing claims, organizing schedules, and being the invisible glue that held the back office together. My grand exit consisted of lukewarm punch and a supermarket cake that did not even get my name right. I looked down at the white icing where "Good Luck, Margaret Dole" was scrawled in blue gel. They had forgotten the why, just like they had forgotten to invite me to the strategy meetings or the holiday bonuses for the executives. I stared at that missing letter and felt a familiar resignation settle in my chest. I did not correct them. I just smiled the same polite, accommodating smile I had worn for decades. "You must be so relieved." Margaret, Sarah, a junior associate who had been there for 6 months, chirped while checking her phone. "Now you can just rest. You will have so much time to babysit your grandkid and play in the garden." "Yes," I said softly, swallowing a bite of the dry cake. "I suppose I will have plenty of time for that." No one asked if I wanted to travel. No one asked if I had plans to write a memoir or learn to paint. In their eyes, I had ceased to be a professional and had simply become an elderly vacancy waiting to be filled with domestic chores. I had been crossed off the list of useful people. I checked my phone, hoping for a call from Ethan. There was only a text message. "Sorry, Mom. Can't make it. Closing a $15 million deal with a new client. Congrats on retiring. You deserve to relax." He was closing a $15 million deal while I was eating a $10 cake. His message was polite, correct, and utterly cold. He placed the deal before his mother, and I forgave him for it because I thought that was how the world worked. Men did important things. Women like me retired to the garden. On the drive back to Brookfield, I passed a new development of luxury townhomes. The signs out front screamed, "Sold," in bold red letters. I gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan, thinking about how my entire life's earnings had barely been enough to keep the mortgage paid on my drafty bungalow. Meanwhile, my son was moving numbers around on a screen that I could not even fathom. When I got home, the house greeted me with the smell of damp wood and settling dust. The late afternoon sun hit the faded floral upholstery of the sofa I had bought second-hand. It looked tired. I looked tired. I took a picture of the living room, trying to make it look cozy, and sent it to Ethan with the caption, "Home Sweet Home. Retirement starts now." He reacted with a simple thumbs up icon. That was it. I sat in the silence, and suddenly, the ghost of my ex-husband, Rick, seemed to fill the room. He had been dead for over 25 years, but his voice was as clear as a bell in the quiet house. "You are only good for small paperwork, Maggie," Rick used to say when I asked about our bills. "Do not dream about business. You would lose every dime if you touched the finances. Leave the thinking to the men." Those words had been a cage I lived in for decades. They were the reason I never took the night classes in accounting I wanted. They were the reason I hoarded coupons instead of buying stocks. I walked over to the hallway closet and reached to the very back, under a stack of old winter blankets. My hands trembled as I pulled out 3 paperback books I had bought at a flea market years ago. The Intelligent Investor, Understanding Market Cycles, Personal Finance for Beginners. I had bought them for 50 cents each and hidden them like contraband. I carried them to the living room and turned on the yellow lamp. I opened the first book, feeling a wave of irrational guilt, as if Rick were going to burst in and mock me. "I am retired," I whispered to the empty room. "I can read whatever I want." Just then, the phone rang. It was a representative from the bank regarding my pension payout. He was cheerful, but the numbers he gave me were like a bucket of ice water. "Based on your contributions, Mrs. Doyle, your monthly payout will be roughly $1,200, he said. $1,200. That would barely cover utilities, food, and the rising property taxes. It certainly would not cover the roof repair the house desperately needed, nor would it pay for the decent nursing home Ethan always joked I would eventually need. I hung up the phone and sat at my small kitchen table. I grabbed a napkin and a pen. For the first time in my life, I wrote down every asset and liability I had. It was a short list. As I stared at the pathetic sum, the realization hit me harder than the silence. "I have spent 60 years working," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "And I do not own a single share of my own life. I was not a partner in my family. I was not a shareholder in my future. I was just an expense waiting to happen. And if I did not change that, I would be nothing but a burden until the day I died." The flyer was pinned to the corkboard in the vestibule of St. Mary's, right next to the sign-up sheet for the fall bake sale. It was simple assistant needed. Organizational tasks and light housekeeping. Must be discreet. I stared at it for a long moment. My pension check had arrived that morning, and after paying the electric bill and setting aside money for groceries, I had exactly $42 left for the rest of the month. I pulled the tab with the phone number, telling myself it was just for pocket money. But deep down, I knew the truth. I would scrub floors until my knees bled before I asked Ethan for a dime. The address led me to the north side of town, where the driveways were long and the gates were iron. Edith Langley's house was not just a home, it was a statement. It was a sprawling brick mansion that smelled of old money beeswax polish, fresh lilies, and silence. Standing in the foyer, clutching my worn handbag, I felt smaller than I had in years. My own house in Brookfield, with its peeling paint and drafty windows, could have fit inside Edith's living room with space to spare. Edith herself was 82 years old, seated in a high-backed velvet chair like a queen on a throne. She was tiny, frail as a dried leaf, but her eyes were sharp, terrifyingly blue lasers that seemed to scan my soul for weakness. The last girl I hired didn't know the difference between a municipal bond and a corporate stock. Edith snapped, tossing a file onto the coffee table. She thought liquidity had something to do with juice. Are you stupid, Mrs. Doyle? I don't know much about stocks, ma'am, I admitted, keeping my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. But I know how to organize a mess, and I know how to listen. Edith stared at me for a long, uncomfortable minute. Then she huffed. Good. You're quiet. I like quiet. The loud ones are always trying to sell you something. My job started as housekeeping, but it quickly shifted. Edith didn't need someone to dust. She needed someone to help her battle the paper tiger of her estate. She had me sorting through stacks of documents that were older than my son yellowing certificates, trust deeds, and dividend reports. For the first time in my life, I held wealth in my hands. Not the abstract numbers Ethan bragged about, but the tangible proof of ownership. One afternoon, as I was filing a stack of statements, Edith slammed her cane against the floor. Vultures, she hissed, looking at a photo of her family on the mantelpiece. My grandson called today. Didn't ask how my heart was. Just asked if I had updated the will. They only see dollar signs in my eyes. Margaret, none of them care how the money was made. They just want to spend it. I froze, a file hovering over the box. Her words echoed the conversation I had with Ethan just 2 days prior, when he had joked about my inheritance covering a nursing home. I know the feeling. I whispered, almost to myself. Edith looked at me sharply. Sit down. Margaret. She pulled a balance sheet from the pile and uncapped a fountain pen. My husband died 30 years ago. He left me a grocery chain and a mountain of debt. Everyone told me to sell. They said a woman couldn't run it. She pointed to a line on the paper. Do you know what this is? It looks like. Math, I said, feeling the old shame Rick had instilled in me rising up. You're not smart enough for this. Maggie. It is power, Edith corrected. This is cash flow. Money coming in versus money going out. It is not rocket science. Margaret. It is just keeping score. Look here. For the next hour. She walked me through the columns. At first, my brain fogged over, panic rising. But Edith was patient in her own prickly way. Slowly, the numbers stopped being terrifying hieroglyphs and started making sense. I realized that the mysterious business world Rick and Ethan treated as a sacred male club was just addition and subtraction. You have a brain. Margaret, Edith said, leaning back, looking exhausted but satisfied. If you had the chance to do it over, to control your own life, would you dare? That question haunted me. Would I dare over the next 6 months? The wall between employer and employee crumbled. We were just 2 women who had survived dismissive husbands and were now navigating the loneliness of being seen as obsolete. We drank tea in her sunroom, and she told me stories of how she bullied bankers into giving her loans in the 70s. When Edith had to go to the hospital for a heart checkup, she did something that stopped my breath. She pressed a heavy, cold brass key into my palm. This opens the wall safe in the library, she said, her voice raspy. The spare copies are with the lawyer, but I don't trust him. He charges me $500 an hour to tell me the sky is blue. I trust you, Margaret. You are the only one who hasn't asked me for a penny. I held the key, feeling the terrifying weight of her trust. That evening, while Edith was at the clinic, I sat in her library. I didn't open the safe. Instead, I pulled a leather-bound book from the shelf titled Family Trusts and Estate Planning. I sat in the wingback chair, the same one where Edith had taught me to read a balance sheet, and I opened the book. I read about revocable living trusts. I read about beneficiary rights. I read until the words blurred, planting a seed in my mind that would eventually grow into a forest of thorns for my son. I realized then that the law was a tool, and like any tool, it worked for whoever held it, not just the men in suits. Edith passed away a year later, slipping out of this world as quietly as a falling leaf. I cried more at her funeral than I had at my own husband's. I was not just mourning the loss of a job. I was grieving the only person who had ever looked at me and seen potential instead of a utility. She had been my teacher, my confidant, and the first person to tell me that I was capable of understanding the language of money. The reading of the will took place in the sterile, air-conditioned conference room of Levin and Cross. Edith's family was there, a collection of nieces and nephews draped in Italian silk and smelling of expensive cologne. They sat around the glass table, tapping on their phones, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a payout. They barely acknowledged me. To them, I was just the help, probably there to collect a final paycheck or a sentimental trinket. I sat in the corner, clutching my handbag, expecting exactly that, a small thank you bonus. David Cross, Edith's personal attorney, cleared his throat and began reading. The nephews straightened up. The nieces leaned in. When David announced that the bulk of the family heirlooms and the mansion were to be liquidated and divided among them, there were nods of satisfaction. But then, David paused. He looked over his glasses directly at me. Regarding the residual estate, David said, his voice steady. Mrs. Langley has established the Langley Independent Trust. This trust includes the rental property on Cedar Avenue, her personal stock portfolio, and a cash injection of $3 million. The room went silent. I felt the blood drain from my face. The sole beneficiary and trustee of this fund, David continued, is Margaret Doyle. The silence shattered. What one of the nephews barked, standing up. That is insane. She was the maid. She was senile. A niece whispered loudly to her husband, "We can contest this." She obviously wasn't in her right mind. I sat frozen, unable to breathe. It felt like I had been yanked from the bottom of the ocean to the surface too fast. My lungs burned. I stared at David, begging him with my eyes to say it was a mistake. David raised a hand, silencing the room. The trust was established 5 years ago, well before Mrs. Langley's health declined. It is ironclad. If you wish to contest it, you will find the legal fees to be exorbitant and the outcome disappointing. After the family stormed out, leaving a wake of insults and threats hanging in the air, David ushered me into his private office. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the glass of water he offered me. "I can't take this, Mr. Cross," I stammered. "It isn't right. I am nobody. Those are her family." David opened a folder and slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was handwritten in Edith's sharp, spidery script, read the addendum. "Margaret," David said gently. I looked down at the note. "If Margaret refuses this, the assets are to be donated to the state. Under no circumstances is this money to return to the grandchildren who I do not trust." I trust the woman who washed my clothes more than the people who never learned how to hold a scrub brush. I traced the ink with my finger, tears blurring my vision. She had protected me, even from my own self-doubt. Under David's guidance, I did not run away. Instead, I opened a new brokerage account. I transferred the assets. I spent nights studying the quarterly reports, just as Edith had taught me. The market was kind over the next few years. The 3 million grew. The rental property appreciated. I reinvested the dividends. Yet, I continued to live in my peeling bungalow in Brookfield. I drove my old car. I clipped coupons. I told no one, especially not Ethan. The voice of my dead husband, Rick, was still a whisper in my ear. If they know you have money, they will bleed you dry. They will laugh at you for trying to be rich. I was terrified that if Ethan knew, he would see me only as an ATM, erasing the mother he claimed to love. By the time the net worth of the trust approached $10 million, David sat me down for a serious conversation about estate planning. You need to decide where this goes when you are gone. Margaret, David said, clicking his pen, do you want to leave it all to your son, or do you want to divide it? Charity A Foundation. The question struck the rawest nerve in my body, the mother in me, the one who had been conditioned to sacrifice everything for her child, rose up. I thought of Ethan working late, his stress about his mortgage, his desire to give his children the best. I wanted to be the hero he never thought I could be. I want it to go to Ethan, I said, my voice firm. I want everything remaining in the trust after I die to go to a fund for Ethan and his family. David nodded and drafted the paperwork. On paper, it was designated as the future inheritance of Ethan Doyle. That was the mistake. That was the moment the $10 million inheritance was born. Ethan eventually found out about the existence of the trust through a slip-up in the mail, but he never asked how I got it or how I managed it. He only heard 10 million and Ethan Doyle. He assumed the money was already his, just waiting for me to get out of the way. He didn't realize that as long as I was breathing, I held the pen, and I could rewrite the ending whenever I wanted. Ethan climbed the corporate ladder at Redwood Harbor Capital with the speed of a man running from his own shadow. Within 2 years, he had traded his starter apartment for a sprawling colonial in Maple Ridge Estates, a neighborhood where the grass was so green it looked painted, and the driveways were filled with gleaming SUVs. I would scroll through his social media feed photos of business dinners in New York, conferences in Vegas, him shaking hands with men in expensive suits, and feel a strange cocktail of pride and alienation. He was my son, yet he felt like a stranger I was watching on a television screen. Our Sunday dinners became a ritual of exclusion. Ethan would hold court at the head of his long mahogany table, talking about IPOs, profit margins, and deals worth $30 million. I sat there, cutting my roast chicken, listening. One evening, I cleared my throat. I was reading about that tech merger in the journal. It reminds me of a strategy Edith used to talk about called Ethan chuckled, cutting me off with a wave of his fork. Mum, are you playing the stock market again? Please tell me you are not actually putting money into things you saw on the news. It is cute that you are interested, but leave the investing to the pros. Okay, I don't want you getting scammed by some internet guru. He smiled at me like I was a toddler showing him a finger painting. He had no idea that my portfolio had outperformed his own company's mid-cap fund for the last 3 quarters. Kayla was no better. She worked in marketing for an online fashion brand and treated me like a fragile antique. Margaret is just the sweetest, most innocent soul. I heard her tell a friend in the kitchen while I was in the living room. She just doesn't get our world. You know, it is all too fast for her. I gripped the arm of the sofa, biting my tongue. The cracks began to show the day Ethan stopped by my house in Brookfield and saw a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. His eyes landed on a thick envelope from Levin and Cross. Legal trouble? "Mom?" he asked, picking it up. My heart hammered against my ribs. No. Just some paperwork regarding the legacy that Mrs. Langley left me, the rental property and such. Ethan tossed the envelope back down, uninterested. Well, let's hope the old lady left you enough to cover a really nice nursing home. Seriously. Mum. Those places cost $5,000 a month now. It would be a huge load off our shoulders if her money covered that. He did not ask how much was in there. He did not ask about the rental income. He just calculated how much of his money he would save on my decline. It was a stark contrast to my meetings with David Cross. In his office, surrounded by leather books, David would look at me sternly. "Margaret, I need you to remember something," he would say. "You are the trustee. You are the beneficiary. This is your power. Do not let anyone, not even your son, make you believe you are just holding this money for them. But at home, Ethan was already spending it. Look, the way the trust is structured." Ethan said one night, sketching on a napkin, "When you are, say, 80 and pass on, that capital transfers to the family trust. That hits right when we need to pay off this house and expand the portfolio. So, really, you are just in a transition phase right now. We will make sure you are comfortable. Of course." I looked at him, realizing he saw me as a temporary vessel for his future wealth. "I am not that old." "Ethan," I said quietly, "I might not need a nursing home. I can live on my own for a long time." Ethan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Mom, come on. You can't stay in that falling down house forever. The world is dangerous. You are vulnerable. You need us to manage things." When Kayla got pregnant with their second child, the trap snapped shut. "We need help." "Mom," Ethan said, his voice taking on a persuasive, almost desperate tone. "The new baby, the job, it is too much. Why don't you move into the suite at our place? The schools are better. The air is cleaner. You can help with the grandkids, and we can stop worrying about you rotting away in Brookfield. It would mean so much to the children to have you close," Kayla added, touching my arm. I looked at their pleading faces. Guilt, that old familiar friend, wrapped its hands around my throat. I agreed because I wanted to be a grandmother, not because I wanted to be a dependent. The day I left Brookfield, I stood on the porch and locked the deadbolt. I ran my hand over the scratched wood of the doorframe, where we had marked Ethan's height with a pencil year after year. "It is just temporary," I whispered to the empty yard. I did not know then that Ethan would view this moment not as a visit, but as an abandonment. In his mind, I had just vacated the property, turning my beloved home into a piece of inventory he called abandoned trash. I walked down the steps, leaving my freedom behind for a suite that would soon feel like a cell. My private suite at Ethan and Kayla's house turned out to be a converted guest room directly adjacent to the laundry room. Kayla called it cozy, but every time the washing machine entered its spin cycle, the floorboards beneath my bed vibrated like a mild earthquake. It was, however, perfectly positioned for me to hear the dryer buzzer and switch the loads before anyone else had to think about it. In the beginning, the arrangement felt like a reprieve from the silence of Brookfield. We had family dinners where I passed the potatoes and told stories about my childhood. I read bedtime stories to my grandchildren, smelling their shampoo and feeling the warmth of their small bodies against mine. Their laughter was a balm that soothed the ache of leaving my home. I told myself this was what family was supposed to look like. But the shift was subtle, like the slow erosion of a cliff face. Because I was home, it made sense for me to pick up the dry cleaning. Because I was not working, it was logical for me to start dinner at 4 o'clock, so it would be ready when Ethan walked in. Because I was there. The vacuuming, the dusting, and the endless pile of dishes became my domain. Kayla was busy with her marketing campaigns, and Ethan was consumed by his deals. I was the 60-year-old woman with nothing better to do, so I became the solution to every domestic inconvenience. The gratitude faded into expectation. One evening, Ethan came home and frowned at a stack of mail on the counter that I had not yet sorted. "Mom, why is the kitchen still a mess?" he asked, loosening his tie. "You have been here all day. It is not like you have a job to get to." I paused while scrubbing a pot. I was helping the baby with his teething. "Ethan," he cried for 2 hours. He sighed, grabbing a water bottle. "Just try to manage your time better. If the kids are running wild and the house is dirty, it adds to my stress. And you know what stress does to my blood pressure? It became my fault. If a child scraped a knee in the backyard, it was because I was not watching closely enough. If the roast was slightly dry, it was because I was distracted. I was no longer his mother. I was an employee who was underperforming. Late one night, I got up to get a glass of water and heard voices drifting from the living room. Ethan and Kayla were having a nightcap. I froze in the hallway shadows. "Thank God for Mum's trust fund," Ethan was saying, his voice low. "That money is going to set us up for life once she passes. Having her live here is, well, think of it as a long-term investment. We save on her housing costs now, and we keep the capital intact for later." I stood there in the dark, clutching my robe. I was not a person to them. I was a depreciating asset they were maintaining until it matured. A few days later, I overheard Kayla on the phone with a friend while she was applying her makeup. "Oh, I know. Childcare is insane." She laughed. "We honestly couldn't afford a nanny right now with the mortgage. But luckily, Ethan's mum is like a free nanny. She is clean, she cooks, and she doesn't complain about overtime." She laughed again. I retreated to my room next to the washing machine and sat on the edge of the bed. I had been reduced to a function, a utility. Despite the resentment growing in my chest, I loved my grandchildren fiercely. But that love became a cage. I could not leave them. I could not take our afternoon off because who would watch the kids? When I told Ethan I needed to go into the city to see David Cross for a portfolio review, his head snapped up. "I will drive you," he said instantly. "You are getting older." "Mom, legal paperwork is tricky. You shouldn't be signing things without me looking them over." He did not want to help. He wanted to supervise. He wanted to make sure I wasn't spending his inheritance. I managed to call David later and change the appointment to a time when Ethan was at work, lying and saying it was a simple dentist visit. But the walls were closing in. Kayla began dropping hints over breakfast. "You know, Ethan, we should really make sure Mum's affairs are streamlined. If she, gets confused later on, it could be a disaster." It is lucky you are here to control things. She smiled at me as she said it, as if my potential senility was a foregone conclusion. The breaking point of my denial came on a Tuesday night. Ethan sat me down at the kitchen table, sliding a document toward me. "Mom?" "I have been thinking," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Just to be safe, we should sign a power of attorney. It would give me full authority to handle your finances if you ever can't. You would just have to live comfortably and play with the grandkids. I would handle all the boring money stuff for you." I looked at the paper. I looked at my son, who smiled with the confidence of a man who had already won. I nodded slowly, pretending to agree, pretending to be the docile old woman he thought I was. "I will think about it." "Ethan," I said softly, but inside my head, Edith Langley's voice was screaming, "Do not let them take the pen. Margaret, never give away your signature." I knew then that I had to leave. The gilded cage was about to be locked, and my son was holding the key. It started with a rug. It was a Persian runner Kayla had bought online, and the corner had a habit of curling up. My grandson, Leo, was running through the hallway, laughing as he chased a plastic truck, when his toe caught that curled edge. He tumbled forward, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a thud that sickened my stomach. He wailed immediately, that high-pitched siren of childhood shock. I was there in a second. I scooped him up, shushing him gently, and inspected the damage. It was a scrape, a tiny, pink abrasion no bigger than a dime. I cleaned it, applied a superhero bandage, and kissed his forehead. By the time he was back to playing 5 minutes later, the tears were dry. The pediatrician, who I called just to be safe, told me it was completely normal for an active 3-year-old. But when Ethan came home and saw the bandage, the atmosphere in the house shifted from calm to combat. "You let him run inside," Ethan shouted, his face turning a shade of red that alarmed me. "Mom? What if he had hit his head? What if he had a concussion? Do you not see that you are losing control?" He tripped. "Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Children trip." I was right there. Kayla stood behind him, wiping at dry eyes. I can't handle the anxiety. "Ethan, I can't leave him alone with her anymore. What if next time it is the stairs, it was theatre? I had raised a son, and I had never broken a bone or missed a fever. Yet, suddenly, I was being painted as a senile hazard to my own grandchildren. Ethan seized the moment like a shark, sensing blood in the water. "This proves it. Mom," he said, pacing the kitchen island, "you are overwhelmed. We need to move forward with the plan. There is a high-end care facility just 20 minutes from here. Doctors on call. No stairs. It is safe." He paused, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And to fund it properly, we sell the Brookfield house. We liquidate that asset, combine it with your trust, and secure everyone's future. It is the only logical move. That house is not an asset." "Ethan," I said, gripping the counter, "it is my home." "The paperwork is complicated." "Stop with the paperwork," he snapped, slamming his hand down. "You are obsessed with that old place. It is a rusty box on a valuable piece of land." "Mom, that is all it is. You are clinging to a corpse. You need to let the younger generation make the decisions now. A rusty box." The words hung in the air, vibrating with contempt. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed in the laundry room annex. The washing machine was silent for once. I stared at the wall, and the fog of guilt finally lifted. Ethan did not care about Leo's knee. He did not care about my safety. He saw me as a dam holding back a river of money, and he was looking for dynamite to blow me out of the way. The next morning, while Ethan and Kayla were at work, I did not start the laundry. I put on my best blazer, walked out the front door, and took 2 buses to the city centre. When I walked into Levin and Cross, I was greeted by David and a younger partner, Gloria Levin. Gloria was sharp, with eyes that reminded me of Edith. I told them everything. I told them about the power of attorney Ethan was pushing for. I told them about the rusty box. David listened, his face grim. Margaret, under the current trust, you are the only one with signature authority. But if you sign a durable power of attorney, he won't need to ask you for money. He can drain the accounts legally. He thinks the money is his, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He calls it his inheritance. Gloria leaned forward, clasping her hands on the table. Let me ask you a question, Mrs. Doyle. If Edith Langley were alive today, and she heard your son call her life's work a guaranteed payout, would she want him to have it? The question hit me like a physical blow. I thought of Edith, who had taught me that money was power, not a gift. No, I whispered. She would have chased him out with a broom. Then let's honor her wishes, Gloria said, and yours. We spent the next 2 hours restructuring the entire estate. We drafted a new trust, the Lantern Women's Fund. This new structure, David explained, pointing to the flowchart, directs 80% of your assets to charitable programs for elderly women. 15% goes to an educational scholarship, and the remaining 5% is for Ethan. I finished, picking up the pen. But only if he meets the conditions. The conditions were strict no bad debt, proof of financial independence, and mandatory family counselling. It was a safety net, not a hammock. My hand shook as I hovered over the signature line. I was signing away the good mother narrative I had clung to for decades. I was breaking the unwritten rule that said a parent must give everything until they are hollow. But then I remembered the way Ethan had looked at my home, the home I had scrubbed and paid for with sweat and called it trash. I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed dark and permanent. It is done, Gloria said softly, witnessing the document. I had just planted the seeds of a storm, but for the first time in years, the air in my lungs felt clean. I was no longer just a grandmother waiting to die. I was the CEO of my own legacy. 2 weeks later, Ethan drove me to a place called the Gilded Oak. It was marketed as a premier senior living community. But as we walked through the lobby with its fake waterfall and chemically clean smell, I knew exactly what it was. It was a warehouse for the inconvenient elderly. Look at this. Mom, Ethan said, gesturing to a group of seniors dozing in front of a mute television. They have a heated pool, a gym, and bingo nights. It is way better than rotting away in that damp Brookfield house. I stopped walking. The air conditioning was too cold, raising goosebumps on my arms. I am not ready for this. Ethan? I said. I can still cook my own meals. I can still tend my garden. Ethan's smile dropped like a stone. He pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of exaggerated patience. Mom, you have to think about us for once, he hissed, keeping his voice low so the receptionist wouldn't hear. We cannot keep driving back and forth. We have the kids. We have jobs. And frankly, that house of yours is a logistical nightmare. It is a trash heap that is sucking up money we could be investing. Trash heap. It was the first time he had said it out loud. I insisted on going back to Brookfield to collect some winter clothes before making any decisions. Ethan agreed, but only because he wanted to assess the property. The ride over was silent. When we pulled into the driveway, the house did look tired. The siding was greying, and the gutters were full of leaves. But to me, it looked like independence. Kayla refused to bring the baby inside. She stood on the front lawn, pressing a scented handkerchief to her nose. I can't bring Leo in there. Ethan, she called out. The mold spores are probably everywhere. It smells like dead things. Inside. I walked to the living room, running my hand over the mantel where Rick's picture used to sit. I heard the click of a camera behind me. Ethan was taking photos of the peeling wallpaper in the corner. Great location, terrible structure. He was muttering into his phone, recording a voice memo for a real estate broker. We are looking at a teardown. Sell it for land value. No inspections needed. I spun around. I never said you could sell it. This is my house. Ethan. Ethan stopped recording. He looked at me with a chilling mix of pity and arrogance. Actually, Mom, it isn't. Remember those papers you signed last year, the ones for tax efficiency? He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, waving it like a flag. You signed the deed over. Technically. I am the primary owner now. You are just a tenant at sufferance. The world tilted on its axis. I remembered signing a stack of papers he had thrust at me during a chaotic dinner, trusting him when he said it was to save me money. He had stolen my home right under my nose. The argument spilled out onto the front porch, loud and ugly. You tricked me, I cried, my voice cracking. You stole my house. I saved you. Ethan screamed back, his face twisting. This house is trash. Mum, I am not letting my wife and kids inherit a burden. I am liquidating this garbage so we can actually afford the life you keep mooching off of neighbours. We're peeking through their blinds. Mrs. Gable was watching from her garden. I felt naked in my shame. But Ethan didn't care. He grabbed my old suitcase from the hallway and began stuffing my clothes into it haphazardly. You're done here, he yelled, throwing a sweater into the bag. You're not staying in this health hazard another night. It is the nursing home or our guest room until a bed opens up. But this place is gone. He dragged the suitcase out and threw it down the stairs. It hit the concrete with a thud that echoed in my chest. Get in the car, he commanded. I looked at the neighbours. No one moved. No one came to save Margaret Doyle. They turned away, not wanting to get involved in a family dispute. I realised then that no cavalry was coming. I was the only soldier left on my side of the battlefield. As I climbed into the back seat of Ethan's luxury SUV, he slammed the door shut. He got into the driver's seat and exhaled loudly, running a hand through his hair. I could practically hear the calculator clicking in his brain, subtracting the mortgage he would pay off once he levelled my home. He thought he had won. He thought he had cleared the board. I sat silently in the leather seat, clutching my handbag tight against my chest. Inside was the folder from Gloria Levin. Ethan had the deed to a trash house, but I held the keys to the $10 million he had already spent in his mind. Drive, I said softly. And he did, steering us both toward a cliff he couldn't even see. Driver, I said, leaning forward as we approached the turn for the highway that led to Maple Ridge. Change of plans. Take me to the financial district. 4th and Main. Ethan had put me in this car assuming I would be delivered like a package to his guest room, waiting to be processed into a nursing home. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed Gloria. The worst has happened, I said into the receiver, my voice dry. Exactly as we predicted. I am coming in. I am ready to go to the final step. 30 minutes later. I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room of Levin and Cross. The city lights below looked like scattered diamonds, cold and distant. Gloria opened her laptop and connected it to the large screen on the wall. A pie chart appeared, displaying the current value of the Langley Independent Trust. $10.2 million, Gloria said, pointing to the bold figure. This is the number your son and his wife talk about at dinner parties. This is the inheritance they have already mentally spent on a vacation home and a portfolio expansion. I looked at the number. It didn't look like freedom anymore. It looked like a weapon. Show me the new structure, I said. Gloria clicked a key. The chart changed. The single block labelled Ethan Doyle vanished, replaced by a complex, multicolored wheel. This is the Lantern Women's Fund, Gloria explained, her voice crisp. It will be governed by a board of trustees. 80% of the annual yield goes to housing initiatives for displaced elderly women. 15% funds the Second Act Scholarship for women starting businesses after 50. And here, she pointed to a tiny sliver, 5%. This is a conditional trust for Ethan. He can access it only if he proves solvency, carries no bad debt, and attends mandatory financial counseling. She slid the heavy document toward me. If you sign this, the old revocable trust is dissolved. The money moves here. Ethan gets nothing, automatically. Not a dime. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand hovered over the paper. Suddenly, the silence of the room was filled with the ghosts of the past. I saw Ethan as a toddler, sleeping on my chest when I was too broke to afford heat. I remembered the nights we ate instant noodles so I could buy him new sneakers for school. The instinct to protect him, to give him everything I never had, pulled at my muscles, trying to force me to put the pen down. I don't know if I can do this to him, I whispered, my voice trembling. He is my only child. Gloria. Gloria did not try to sell me on revenge. She did not insult him. She simply leaned forward and asked the question that cut through the fog. Margaret, look at this paper. Are you signing this to punish a man, or are you signing this to decide what the legacy of two overlooked women, Edith and yourself, will serve? Do you want this money to buy another luxury car? Or do you want it to ensure that another woman never has to stand on her porch and be called trash? I closed my eyes. I heard the slam of the car door. I heard the word garbage. I opened my eyes and pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my full name. Then I initialed every page. With each stroke of ink, I felt a heavy chain snapping. It is done, Gloria said, witnessing the final page. Legally speaking, Ethan Doyle no longer has an inheritance from you. Now, I said, looking up. What about the house? He tricked me into signing the deed. He says he owns it. David Cross, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned around with a small, sharp smile. He owns the remainder interest. Margaret. But when we did that transfer for tax purposes years ago, I insisted on retaining a life estate for you. It means that while he holds the title, you hold the exclusive right to use, occupy, and profit from the property until your death. He cannot sell it, rent it, or tear it down without your signature. He thinks he can, I said. He is wrong, David said. And here is the interesting part. The city has a community land trust that buys life estates to preserve affordable housing. They are willing to buy your interest out for a lump sum. It is not market value, but it is enough to buy a very comfortable, modern condo here in Cleveland. Cash. He slid a second document toward me. If you sign this, you are selling your right to live there to the city trust. Ethan will still own the dirt, but he will be legally blocked from developing it or selling it until the trust expires, which could be 50 years from now. I didn't hesitate this time. I signed the transfer of the life estate. An hour later, I walked out of the building pulling my suitcase. The night air was biting, but I felt incredibly warm. I had a cashier's check in my purse large enough to buy a new life, and I had a signed trust document that secured my legacy. I looked up at the moon and smiled. I just made a massive withdrawal from my son's account. I said to the empty street, I hadn't broken the law. I had simply corrected a typo in the story my son had written for himself. 3 weeks later, the silence of my new life was broken by the frantic vibrating of my phone. I didn't answer. I knew what was happening. Ethan had just opened his email. He had received a notification from the bank stating that he was no longer the designated beneficiary of the Langley Independent Trust. When he tried to call David Cross, demanding answers, he was met with a polite stonewall regarding client confidentiality. Almost simultaneously, his real estate broker had called him with news that was even worse. When Ethan tried to list the Brookfield property as a tear-down lot, the title search flagged a massive obstruction. The life estate I held the legal right to occupy the property had been transferred to the Cleveland Community Land Trust. The city now held the right to use that house until the day I died. Ethan owned the dirt, but he could not touch the house. He could not demolish it, and he certainly could not sell it to a developer. His assets were frozen. His sure thing had evaporated. An hour later, my doorbell rang. My new apartment in Cleveland was on the 4th floor of a refurbished brick building. It was flooded with light, filled with ferns and peace lilies, and smelled of fresh coffee. It was modest, but it was mine. Ethan stood in the hallway, his face pale and his tie crooked. He looked like a man who had been running a marathon in a suit. "What did you do?" he gasped, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation. "Mom." "What did you do with my money?" I closed the door gently. "Sit down." Ethan. He didn't sit. He paced my small living room, his eyes wild. "The bank said the accounts are closed to me. The broker said I can't sell the house because the city has a claim on it. I have loans." "Mum?" "I took out a second mortgage on Maple Ridge based on the inheritance I leveraged the sale of Brookfield. If I don't show liquidity by next month, I am underwater." He looked at me, his eyes pleading and accusing all at once. "Why are you ruining me?" "I am not ruining you," I said, walking to the armchair and sitting down. "I am simply correcting a mistake. That money, the $10.2 million, was never yours. It was a legacy Edith Langley left to me. But you don't need it," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You are old. You were just going to give it to me anyway. I earned it by taking care of you." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my little boy. I saw a stranger consumed by greed. "You earned it?" I asked quietly. "You think you earned my life's savings by letting me sleep next to your washing machine? You think you earned the right to sell my home by calling it trash?" "I sacrificed for you," Ethan yelled, throwing his hands up. "I gave you a place to live. And who paid for your college? Ethan? I asked, my voice hardening. Who worked the night shift at the diner for 4 years after your father left so you could have braces? Who paid the mortgage on that trash house every single month for 40 years so you would have a roof over your head? That house was paid for with my sweat, not your imaginary inheritance. Ethan stopped pacing. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. The anger drained out, replaced by a terrifying desperation. He sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. Mom, please, he sobbed. You can't do this. I will lose the house. I will lose my reputation at the firm. I thought I had a safety net. I thought it was guaranteed. It was heartbreaking to watch him crumble. But it was a necessary pain. He had built his entire life on the foundation of my death. There is still a safety net, I said softly. But it is not a hammock. I set up a new trust. If you get into debt counseling, if you prove you can live within your means for 2 years, and if you attend family mediation, the board might approve a grant to help you. But I cannot sign for it. I will not bail you out. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. You are making me beg strangers for my own money. It is not your money, I repeated, emphasizing every word. It never was. He stood up, wiping his face with his sleeve. He looked around my apartment, at the simple furniture, at the books on the shelf, and he realized he had no power here. I am leaving, he muttered. Ethan, I called out before he reached the door. He stopped, his hand on the knob, not looking back. You kicked me out of the home I bought. You called my life trash. You thought you had won everything. But you only kicked away the last person who would have trusted you with a blindfold on. I walked out that door with the only things that actually belonged to me. My self-respect and the money that another woman trusted me to protect. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders shaking. Then he opened the door and slammed it shut behind him. The sound echoed, but this time, it didn't make me jump. I sat in the silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Then I stood up, went to the kitchen, and brewed a pot of chamomile tea. I opened my laptop on the small dining table. There was an email from Gloria Levin. The subject line read, First Workshop Registration. The Lantern Women's Fund was launching its first program, a financial literacy course for women over 50 in Brookfield. I clicked on the link and saw my name listed not as Ethan's mother, but as Margaret Doyle, Program Advisor. I took a sip of tea and smiled. I had rewritten the will, but more importantly, I had rewritten the rest of my life. Thank you so much for tuning in to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach more people who need to hear it.